I have to start with two apologies. The first apology is for having to address you in this global language of English, because I really do not speak German. But if I addressed you in my native language, which is Welsh, you would not thank me at all. So English is the least bad option. Secondly, I think I have to apologize, or at least to make clear the fact that most of the people that you have listened to in this series of lectures have been eminent Marxist theorists. And I have to confess, I'm not. I have never had the resources in my life to sit down and systematically study Marx. So I'm not a scholar of Marx. My relationship with Marx has been first as in my youth in the 1960s and 70s as a trade union activist and as a feminist, and later as a researcher, just trying to make sense of the world, trying to understand the world, trying to understand what is happening to social divisions of labour and technical division of labour and how they change. And I have gone to Marx because Marx has given me tools for understanding it, which I have found nowhere else. So what I'm hoping to do today is to share with you some of the ideas that I have taken from Marx over the years, which have helped me to, if you like, create a conceptual framework for understanding how things are developing and will develop further in the future, or may develop further in the future. So it's more of a toolkit, really, than an analysis of Marx. But I want to do this mainly because the more I do research on what is happening to labour in contemporary capitalism, and the more I read Marx, the more convinced I am of his absolute relevance for our current understanding of the economy and of society, and of the continuing relevance for the future. And there are very many ways windows, if you like, that you can take to look into the encyclopedic work of Marx. And the one that I've chosen to use as my starting point may seem rather perverse, and it's the household. Because if you read Capital, and Marx never actually really explicitly talks about the household as a household, but it seems to me that the concept of the household is absolutely intrinsically there in many, many different ways in Marx, and that by understanding the dynamics of change in the household, in its relation to the broader economy and in its internal divisions of labour, it seems to me that that's one of the best ways that we can actually start to understand the changes that are taking place. So, the household in Marx, first of all, it's the place where social reproduction takes place. Secondly, it's also where the reproduction of labour power takes place, more specifically, the reproduction of labour power takes place. It's important to separate those two things, it seems to me. Third, it's where consumption takes place. Fourth, it's a site of primitive accumulation. It's a site where things that have been outside, so to speak, the scope of capitalism, capitalism in its insatiable need to constantly expand, to constantly generate new commodities from which to make new profits. The activities that take place in the household, if you like, are still taking pre-capitalist forms that are up to now have been producing only use values, are a site of accumulation for the transformation, for the development of new commodities where the use values can also be given exchange values. Just as surely as, the soil can be mined for gold or the rainforest can be milked for DNA, the human body and the social relations of the household are also a site of accumulation. I'll talk talk about that a bit more later. So it's really important to see the household as a kind of reservoir of potential new commodities, in my view. It's the household is complicated because it has its own internal social relationships, which power relationships between different household members, but the internal social relations may include both paid and unpaid labour being provided within the household. And indeed, Marx's own household is a case study of the extremely complicated nexus of social and financial and other relationships that go on in the household. I'm thinking particularly of his relationship with his servant, who was sometimes but not always paid, and his fathering of a child with her, and so on. So the household is this very, very complex space which mediates with the wider economy in a number of different ways, and which is a site of shifting and complex social relations in itself. But it also represents a contradiction which it's never really properly explored in Marx. Marx and Engels particularly kind of mention it as an issue, but they never really explore the implications of it. And that is that the labour theory of value is fundamentally built on this idea that the worker produces value through his labour, and some of that value is taken by the capitalist as surplus value, and the remainder is the value that is needed for the subsistence of the worker. But it's never made clear whose subsistence you're talking about, that, because the household typically has more than one person in it, very often more than one worker. So when you're trying to calculate the value of the worker's subsistence, are you talking about that worker's individual subsistence, or the subsistence of that worker and his children, or his partner, or her partner? And it's very, very unclear, this question of whose subsistence is being clawed back from capital. So the labour theory of value is kind of skates over this very actually contradictory idea of how you calculate whose subsistence is paid for out of that portion of the worker's time that is clawed back from capital. And the way that it's dealt, I'm going forward. The way that, I haven't got to put it on a slide, the way that Marx and Engels deal with it is actually quite shocking when they're talking about the use of child labour and women's labour, which, of course, they observed in factories of Manchester, in the early 19th century. And the way they make sense of it is they say that the women and the children are the property of the head of the household, who's the father, and so they are therefore his slaves. So that in sending the children and the wife to work in the factory, the male head of the household is acting as a slave owner. Now, this is, this is pretty contentious, and I don't want to go into it here, but I'm saying that to draw attention to the fact that this is clearly something that worried them, and that it was very, very underexplored in Marx, as indeed are many other aspects of gender relations. But I think we have to be aware of that contradiction as part of the problem of actually applying the labour theory of value in a society in which the majority of households with more than one adult in, both of those adults are working. So that's part of the context here. Now, having sketched out this complicated space, which is the household, I now want to talk about how the household is the place where we can see the dynamics of change in the labour market, in particularly the transformation of what Marx would have called unproductive labour, in the sense that it's not productive for capital, into productive labour. But first of all, I just want to outline a little bit. This is a diagram that I've used elsewhere to help clarify thinking about this question of what's productive labour and what's unproductive labour. In the 1970s, when I was young, this concept of productive and unproductive labour was very, very contentious among Marxists. Particularly public sector workers didn't like it because they didn't like the idea that they were seen as, they wanted to think that they were part of the working class and that they were productive workers. And a lot of feminists didn't like the idea that some sort of service work were labelled unproductive. And so I'm actually make a similar distinction to Marx, but I prefer to call it reproductive labour. Instead of calling it unproductive labour, if you can see, this is a matrix. Down the left-hand side, I make a distinction between reproductive labour, that is labour which produces use values for society as a whole. It's not directly productive for capital, but it's more generally productive in the sense that it's producing values for the whole of society and for capitalism as a whole. And then at the bottom row, I talk about labour which is directly productive for capital. You know, people who are directly in that conflictual relationship which constitutes capital, whereby workers, the value of what they produce is expropriated to produce capital, and workers are put in a directly conflictual relationship with capitalist employers. So that's that one side of the grid. The other side of the grid looks at paid labour and unpaid labour. So you've got in reproductive labour, which is paid labour, includes a whole lot of public service work. It includes private servants. Marx always argued that somebody who's employed as a private servant in somebody's home is not a productive worker for capital because they're paid out of the revenue. They're paid out of the house. They're not in a directly conflictual relationship. But once they start working for a capitalist employer, they become productive workers. So that top left-hand corner is paid labour, which is not directly productive. But you also have unpaid labour, which is not directly productive, which includes all kinds of traditional kinds of domestic labour, childcare, household maintenance, artistic and cultural labour, which is not paid, which is done for the, for its use values, and so on. And then in the bottom row, you've got in that quadrant C, you've got labour which is directly involved in producing commodities, direct labour which is working directly for capitalist employers. And in the fourth corner, you have a category of labour which is not, people don't pay so much attention to, which I will explain further later on, which is what I call consumption work, which is work that makes the productive labour for capitalists more productive. Which is unpaid labour done by consumers. But it's not the kind of unpaid labour which is directly producing use values. It's a kind of unpaid labour which is, so to speak, the last stage of the commodity distribution process. So it's like, self-service in a supermarket, for instance. You're making the work of the supermarket employees more productive by doing the unpaid work related to the consumption of those goods. Anyway, so this is the kind of general framework that I'm working with. I'm now going to switch to looking at there are very, very dynamic movements of labour between these categories. They're not static at all. They're historically changing, and they change over space and time. And I'm going to switch to another diagram, and I have to apologize in advance for the very lurid colors for which you can blame Microsoft. I was working on a plane on a laptop. So I'm going to present this in a slightly different way. You've got unpaid labor carried out in the home and the community, the social reproduction labor. Then you've got paid private service work for other households, like domestic servants, like, farm laborers and so on. Then you've got paid, which are both, in Marx's terms, unproductive, what I call reproductive labour. Then you've got this category, which is paid labour for companies in production industries, which is productive labour in Marx's terms. And then you've got paid public service work, which is, again, it's not productive, but it's reproductive paid work. And you've got private service work for companies, which in Marx's terminology is productive, but it's working for production companies. And then you've got this consumption work that I talked about earlier. Now, the point is that there is, if you keep these categories in your head, you can start to understand various historical shifts. For instance, historically, when you've got a development of social inequalities and a need for some women to enter the workforce, then they employ other women to do their household work for them. You saw that historically with the employment of domestic servants in the 19th century. We're seeing it now as a result of austerity, particularly in areas like elder care and childcare and so on. One group of women are able to go out to work because they pay another group of women to work privately for them in their homes. So you've got a big shift of work into that category. But then, as capitalism develops, through urbanization, through proletarianization, through economies of scale and so on, increasingly that kind of private work that was done by individually employed people in people's homes gets transformed into work for capitalist service companies. So you've got childcare companies, cleaning companies, laundries in the 19th century. You get this growth of these service industries providing services to the household. In another trend in the mid-20th century, you had the development of the welfare state, certainly in most European countries in the period after, especially after World War II, partly as a response to demands coming from the labour movement and from social democratic. And there you've got the social reproductive labour being socialised in the form of public service employment. So in the mid-20th century, you saw a huge growth in paid public service work. Then the development, and this is where technology starts coming in. You also have, simultaneously with all these developments, you have the replacement of services by goods. So you have the washing machine instead of the laundry, and so on. And what that did historically is particularly... it happened right through the history of capitalism, of course, in the 19th century, the soap industry, the clothing industry, and so on. But particularly from the 1920s onwards, from the spread of electricity, there was a huge growth in the manufacturing industries, manufacturing machines and goods that substituted for services that had been provided in the home previously. So that's a huge growth in, if you like, the industrial working class, because of all the labour shifting into commodity production. As the technology develops, as all these new manufacturing industries grow, and as the pressure on households to maximise their earning potential, as more and more women enter the labour market, for instance, so there's more of a time squeeze on households, you get the buy instead of make logic. creeps in, and the new commodities, the new washing machines and so on become more complex. And so as the need to research and purchase and consume and maintain these new products grows, so does the unpaid consumption work. So a new kind of unpaid work in the home replaces the older kinds of unpaid work in the home. What used to be just like, scrubbing the floor becomes spending hours on the phone talking to the call center about why your vacuum cleaner doesn't work, It's the ultimate use value of cleaning the floor is still the same, but the kind of labour involved is very different. And then I haven't finished. You can go on and on with this typology. As the private services become more sophisticated, and particularly with the introduction of digitalization, there's also a huge growth in self-service in relation to accessing services, which again produces more consumption work. Where are we? Just to round this up, as the technical division of labour becomes more and more complex in commodity production, you've got value chains that spread around the world, making these commodities as cheaply as you possibly can. More and more aspects of that production process get outsourced. The whole production process becomes more and more fragmented. And so you get new business services developing, private business services which are supplying the manufacturing industry. And so this nexus down here, the yellow and the orange corners, which these are the, if you like, these are the productive workers in Marxist terms, don't forget, in these two categories. These are growing and growing and growing all the time in relation to the other kinds of activities. And then finally, on top of all this, we've had a development which has just absolutely accelerated over the last 20 years, which is the outsourcing of public services. If you like, the recommodification of that which was decommodified in the 20th century. So all these public services, which, don't forget, in most OECD countries, up until the financial crisis, up until 2008, more than 46% of GDP was public services. So that is a huge field of accumulation for capitalists. If all those public services can be turned into commodities, commodified services that are generating profit, that's a vast new field of accumulation for capital. So that's another enormous, if you like, dragging more and more workers within the scope of that direct capitalist labour relationship. Then we have other things going on. Austerity policies also, cutting the public services, creating new kinds of pushing work back into the home, making poor households to do again things that previously were done for them by public services, cutting care for the elderly, childcare, care for disabled people, school meals, all those kind of things. So you've got a very dynamic movement in that direction. And here we come to what my current research is focused on. The very, very rapid development of online platforms for carrying out household services which were previously carried out mostly in the informal economy, in that sort of direct master-servant kind of relationship where people, it's not new to employ a babysitter or a cleaner or somebody to cut your hedge or whatever. But what is relatively new is, in the past, an awful lot of that work was carried out in the informal economy. People paid cash in hand, rather invisible in the statistics, not taken seriously by labour sociologists as a field of research. And suddenly, what we have are these online platforms which are, so to speak, formalizing the informal economy. They are the kinds of workers who previously, in the past, would have found work through informal word-of-mouth networks, through sticking leaflets through letterboxes, through knocking on doors, through putting an ad in the local paper, etc. They can no longer find work that way because everything's been replaced by the Google search. And online platforms of using the power of the tag, can tag every postcode in Austria. They can say plumber, electrician, roofer, cleaner, etc. So if you go to Google and you put in your postcode and you say, I want a local plumber, the chances are very high you won't find a local plumber. You'll find a global platform which will supply you with a local plumber, but who will be a local plumber who's subjected to the discipline of a global corporation, the time discipline, and the discipline through the use of customer ratings, who takes a 25% cut rent from the value of each transaction. And so what these online platforms are effectively doing is delivering very, very, very large numbers of isolated workers around the world, and I do mean around the world. I mean into the hands of a new generation of global corporation. So they're creating a new, they're expanding enormously the working class in this category. And of course we know that the way from history tells us that capitalism doesn't stand still, so the online platforms will not remain in their present form because there's always a limit to how productive a service worker can be, which is where automation comes in. So Uber, for instance, which started off with a business model which was based on not investing in cars and persuading, taking a rent from employing workers who had themselves invested in the depreciating asset of the car. That was their original business model. But what are they doing now? Now they've established near monopolies in many American cities. They're investing in self-driving cars. What is Amazon doing after creating jobs for hundreds of thousands of precarious delivery workers around the world? What are they doing? Investing in drones. So this pattern of automation, of goods replacing services, is continuing. So we've got this very pattern developing. So, but I think we also have to remember that all these new means of production, there's a whole lot of stuff around in the media at the moment about how, robots are going to take all the jobs and there's going to be mass unemployment and, I guess people were saying that about looms, Looms don't buy clothes, In the 1970s, people were saying robots don't buy cars. Capitalism will come to its knees. All the jobs will disappear. The reality is, of course, that capitalism has this amazing ability to generate new commodities, and not least of the new means of production. So, you've got drones, you've got 3D printers, you've got robots. They've got to be made. Somebody's got to make them. Probably the factories won't be in the same places as the factories that made the cars and the printing machines or whatever of the late 20th century. But they need new factories, they need more materials, they need new workforces, they need constant innovation. Because one of the other extraordinary myths, which seems to be around on the left as well as the right, is this idea you can have total automation. You can have, every factory in the world can be equipped with robots, which will then just get on with kind of making stuff. And you think, well, what kind of a business model? How could that work for capitalists? You go out and buy the robots at the market price. you buy your raw materials at the market price, they make a standard profit, product. How can you possibly make it so that your product is going to sell better than the product of the identical factory around the road? And, you know, that model has never worked for capitalism. And if you think about it, imagine, say, I don't know, 1993 or something like that. You could have imagined that all the world's offices would somehow be productive. Everybody would have I've forgotten even what they were called, those computer 386, you know, Pentium 386, running some early version of Windows, and suddenly it's all going to stop and the whole world is going to be run by this particular stage of technology. I mean, it just doesn't work as a model at all. So it's absolutely clear that there's going to be a huge new wave of manufacturing industries is going to grow and that will, of course, generate new service industries, and the wheel will go round and round, or will it? Because, you know, there are some finite things in the world, like natural resources, for instance. I've skated through that very quickly. This is my last. Am I going over time? Well, no, anyway, this is my last time. I don't want to sort of get into... I could talk for a very long time about the future of work, and I don't really want to do that. What I want to talk about is what are the strategic implications of all this analysis for socialists and for feminists. And I think one of the things we really need to do is to actually develop an understanding of what the new working class looks like, which workers are now directly involved in producing value for capitalists and which aren't. Because there's a gap. We all know class consciousness is not the same thing as objective class position. And there are an awful lot of workers around the world right now who probably don't see themselves in any way as part of the working class. Partly, I mean, if they're somewhere like India, they might feel, oh, I'm doing so well working with this online platform. I'm earning twice as much as I would in the local labour market. I think of themselves as privileged and bourgeois. There are public sector workers who still have a public sector consciousness, who still can't bear to think of themselves as industrial workers. They think of themselves as a caring person who looks after sick people or whatever, rather than a capitalist. So it seems to me that it's a necessary precondition, really, for understanding how new solidarities can develop across national and ethnic and other boundaries. We have a very, very split working class right now. We have the solidarities that were generated in the mid-20th century between, it was a historically almost unique moment where the organised working class built solidarity with the reserve army. Capitalism has always played off the organised workers against the reserve army in various ways. And sometimes workers have resisted that and sometimes they've capitulated. And in the mid-20th century, because the reserve army was mainly a national reserve army, because there was still a lot of national capitalists, it was possible to have this kind of dialogue, this social dialogue between a national government and trade unions that represented the workers and employers, and to strike a deal that didn't just look after the organised workers, but also looked after the unemployed. And it was seen as in the interests of the unemployed and of the organised workers, that the unemployed should get generous enough benefits that they wouldn't be tempted to cross a picket line, you know, because they were starving, you know. It was seen as in the interests of organised workers that there was a welfare safety net, and that gave us various different models of welfare capitalism around Europe. And that started to fall apart because of globalization, because the reserve army became a global reserve army that was either accessed through offshoring the work, you know, sending the work to China or whatever, or through using migrant workers. But the solidarities, the social and cultural solidarities between the reserve army and organised labour broke down in a fatal way, and, well, near fatal in some European countries now. You look at these new political movements and they're really scary, you know, which are based on demonizing the reserve army. And so it seems to me that in order to try and build new solidarities, it's really important to actually understand where people people's work sits in the overall organisation of capitalism. So that's a kind of quite a boring task that researchers have to do, but it seems to me very necessary in order to build these new solidarities. Secondly, we need to develop strategies in relation to reproductive labour. Feminists have always traditionally argued that the fact that women do much more of the unpaid reproductive labour in the home contributes directly to women's unequal treatment in the broader labour market. And so feminists have always been looking for strategies to address, if you like, the problem of housework. And traditionally, they are going right back to, Zetkin and Kollontai in the first wave feminism, that the demand was to socialise reproductive labour through public services, public laundries, public health services, public childcare, etc., etc. Another strategy has been wages for housework, and the modern day equivalent of that, of universal basic income, is to provide a kind of money for women who are working, or anybody who's at home doing that reproductive labour. And a third strand in the thinking has been to put our faith in automation, to think that, science and progress will automate domestic labour out of existence. We'll all have so many wonderful new appliances that nobody will need to, you'll just need to press a few buttons. And I think the history of the last 50 years has shown that none of these strategies actually is very successful. The public services, we're all on the back foot trying to defend the services that are being axed, rather than going forward and finding new ones. And an awful lot of the services that we fought for have actually been replaced. The mental health nurses are replaced by commodities like drugs, mind-expanding drugs. So commodification is constantly providing new kinds of goods and new kinds of market solutions to things that were originally seen as social problems. So in fact, none of those three strategies in and of itself has actually been at all successful. There have been, some changes in the household division of labour and so on, but none of those strategies has really worked as a feminist strategy. And it seems to me that the reason for that is because capitalism continues to find new means to commodify social reproduction through the market. And while it's doing that, it's also creating a new working class, simultaneously creating new kinds of unpaid consumption work and creating new kinds of paid work for capitalists. So that takes us right back to the first bullet point, that it actually leads us to strategies that involve organising at the workplace as well as at the point of consumption. So I think that's it. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.